That's 3-point drop in 1 year. That's the highest drop since.
Lessons from history, the legendary journalist Carl Bernstein.
Good evening. I'm Gadi Levy, the Executive Director of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, a home for all things Jewish, where we build community by exploring books and music, history, food, politics, popular culture, ancient text, science, and films together. This semester, we are proud to host many distinguished writers, thinkers, and entertainers. Next week, Linda Greenhouse will speak with Floyd Abrams about the future of the Supreme Court, and Ambassador David Friedman will take us behind the scenes of the negotiation that led to the Abraham Accords. Over the next few weeks, among many others, We will also welcome Deborah Lipstadt, Matt Damon, Harvey Fierstein, Frank Bruni, Judy Collins, Tina Brown, and Dr. Albert Bourla, CEO of Pfizer, who was just awarded the Genesis Prize yesterday. I hope you will join our community often. Jewish tradition teaches us that the truth is the tree of life. Our guest tonight, Carl Bernstein, made that his own when he said, "You can't serve the public's good without the truth as the bottom line." And he's been striving for that bottom line for more than 50 years. Although, as he admits in his new book, Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom, he got off to a rocky start as a teenager. He was saved by old school newsrooms back when journalists were still given the time to dig for the complete picture, and facts were more important than clicks. By the age of 24, Mr. Bernstein was already reporting for the Washington Post, and before he turned 30, he and his partner, Bob Woodward, had won the paper a Pulitzer Prize for peeling away at a minor break-in at the Watergate and forcing a president to resign. Since then, Carl had continued to investigate and reveal abuses of power for magazine articles, in best-selling books, and on television, especially CNN. He joins us tonight for a look back, not only at his own career, but at the journalism that once was. In conversation with Molly Jong-Fast, a writer for The Atlantic and author of its newsletter, Wait, What? She also hosts the popular postcard, The New Abnormal. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat function at any time. We will get to as many as possible. In the chat function, you will also find a link to purchase the book if you are interested, and to Molly's newsletter, Wait, What? And one for a podcast. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Carl Bernstein and Molly Jong-Fast.
Hi, everybody. Very excited to have Carl tonight and get to interview him. And we're, very excited to talk about this book. So I wanted to start by talking to you about how this book you took, and you started this book when you were very young. Can we talk about this?
The book, Chasing History, A Kid in the Newsroom, is really about my apprenticeship in the newspaper business. And at age 16, I had, just been introduced in this way, I sort of had one foot in the classroom, one foot in the juvenile court, one foot in the pool hall, and the foot in the classroom was only in about that far. But my father got me an interview at the afternoon paper in Washington, the Washington Star, a better paper in those days than the Washington Post, to get a job as a copy boy. And so I got the best seat in the country at age 16. I'd been there a few weeks and I found myself, for instance, at Burning Tree Country Club, watching President Eisenhower in his last days in office sinking putts on a practice green so close to him that I could see the brown spots on his hands. I wasn't there to be a reporter. I was there to run an errand, take a photographer's rolls of film back to the office. But I had this amazing, as I say, best seat in the country as a kid. And everything in my life really goes back to this formative period at the Washington Star. And I've always known I wanted to write about it. And the book itself only covers those 5 years I was at the Washington Star. It's not the old man looking back. It's written in the voice of this kid from his point of view. And yet, I think, and certainly what the reviews have said, others have said, that it resonates to today. There's a straight line. It's almost a kind of prequel to All the President's Men. And it's about journalism, and it's about what's going on in the country in an extraordinary time in our history.
Let's talk about when it's set, because I think that is a really important element to the story. Explain to us exactly the time period that you worked at the Washington Star.
Well, very significantly. And also I should add here that I'm a second generation native of Washington, D.C. And this book is very much about the nation's capital both the gleaming monuments that we all know, but also about the back streets and alleys that I got to know as a kid. I'd known some of them before I went to work at the Star, and then covering all kinds of things: murders, suicides, car wreck crashes, robberies, et cetera, et cetera. I learned also the back alleyways. But the 5 years at the Star, 1960 to 65, bracket the Civil War by exactly 100 years afterwards. And the Washington, D.C. that I grew up in, as did my mother, was a Jim Crow town. And so in the country and in the Capitol at this time, the civil rights movement is beginning to start to change the country. And I was lucky enough in those early days to cover civil rights, both in Jim Crow Washington, in Jim Crow suburbs where I went to high school. For instance, very early on in Bethesda, Maryland, the main shopping street in Bethesda, the ice cream parlor, the bowling alley, the movie theater were segregated. And it's very hard for people in this country, I think, to comprehend that until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, when I was in the 6th grade in the District of Columbia public schools, I went to a legally segregated public school in the capital of the United States. Restaurants downtown were segregated when I grew up until the mid-50s. And my parents were active in sit-ins at the lunch counters to integrate those lunch counters and the tea rooms and restaurants in DC. So it was a very different world. Jim Crow Washington, Jim Crow capital of the United States, Jim Crow southern states of the United States. Also, it's the beginning of the anti-war movement. It's the buildup in Vietnam. The first few weeks I was there, I covered John Kennedy coming to my high school, the state editor of the paper. And this is what the book is about, this intermix of the big and the small. And my first weeks at the paper, it was about 10 days before the election between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Kennedy came to my high school, and the state editor said, look, we've got our top political reporter coming to cover the speech. Maryland could be the crucial state. It's a close election between Kennedy and Nixon. But you know the school. You know the grounds. So I want you to stay on those grounds, talk to the rewrite man, talk to this political reporter when he gets there, cover the crowd. So, and then subsequently, I covered Kennedy. I went to his press conferences. I covered the assassination, all these amazing events in history. And as I say, big and small, plane crashes, every kind of experience you could have as a reporter.
Do you want to just talk about a few of the big ones that are in the book?
I'm going to talk about an unusual that had huge effect on me. One of the things that I did as a copy boy when I was still 16 and 17, and I was 5'3" and freckled and still growing. And I had a kind of innocent look about me. And my mentor at the Star was a great editor named Sid Epstein. And I've been blessed. I've had probably the two greatest editors you can imagine, Sid Epstein and Ben Bradley at the Washington Post. But one of the things I would do is there would be a terrible accident or a suicide or a drowning, and I would be sent to the home of the deceased to get a picture of the victim. And I was pretty adept at it. And it was important to connect with the people there and recognize what they were going through. This is not just an errand. This is a terrible moment in these people's lives. Mm-hmm. And there was a drowning of two kids in Northwest Washington. They lived in Northwest Washington. They drowned in West Virginia, 15, 16 years old. And I went to the house of one of them, sent there to get a picture. And a young man, about 30 years old, answered the door. And I said to him, I hate to disturb you. I'm Carl Bernstein from the Washington Star. And I'm here to get a picture. I'd like to get a picture of your brother. I know it's a terrible time in your family, but could we have a picture? He said, sure. I'll be back with you in a minute. Comes back with a picture not of a 16-year-old kid, but of somebody who's maybe 32, 34 years old. And he gives me the picture. I say, no, I wanted a picture of your brother Billy. And he said, oh my God, what happened? What do you mean?
Oh.
And all of a sudden, I started to put two and two together. And I realized that the child, 15-year-old who had drowned, was the brother of a DC cop who had been killed 2 weeks earlier. And I had brought this brother the news of his other brother drowning. Very little has stuck with me as much as that day. And the reason was that it's another side of this business that reminds me what we have to do in terms of realizing we're dealing with human beings, not just pushing a notebook in somebody's face or a microphone and running out to get the story. And I had to talk to this man for a while and tell him what had happened. I went back to the office and I got the picture, incidentally, of the child who had drowned. And I told Sid Epstein, this city editor, I said, I don't think I want to do that anymore. But I did. And that became part of what I did throughout journalism. The stories that were horrible, not just triumphant, not just political, but the lesson of this had to do with the human connection. And for some reason, it's always stuck with me as much as any big story that I ever covered.
Do you think that, do you feel there were more resources for journalism back then? Like you're talking about copy boys, and I mean, it just seems like there was more sort of a business, that there was just more available for journalism.
No, I think today we have incredible tools that we didn't have then. We have the internet. We have the ability to use Google. We have Wikipedia, all this instantaneous information at our fingertips. The huge problem, I think, that we have in journalism today and have had for a while with the internet, with that easy accessibility to what should be background information, and also background information that needs to be checked. Look at the errors in Wikipedia. Look at the errors that Google comes up with, that online stuff has, especially social media. But those are tools, and they're great tools to help us report better. What you see in this book is this kid learning how you report. You go out of the office. You go and meet people. You make sources. You go to source after source after source, just as we did in Watergate. And so there's a kind of straight line from this book to All the President's Men that is about the process of reporting. And what is good reporting? Woodward and I have used the phrase for almost 50 years now, the best obtainable version of the truth. At the Star, we called it the complexity of the truth, involving context, involving multiple sources. We had a two-source rule during coverage of Watergate. You had to have the information from at least two sources before we would put it, or Ben Bradley would allow us to put the information in the paper. We had that at the Star. We just called it multiple sources. You have to go, keep going, one source after another. The business of looking for information at night that you see in the movie of All the President's Men, going to people's homes. People did that routinely at the Washington Star. The Star, as I said, was a better paper than the Washington Post in the days when I went to work there. But pretty much everything I know, I learned there about journalism. It was a formative period in my life, and it was also a formative period in the country's life.
Can you explain what you mean when you say that the Star was a better paper than the Washington Post?
Sure. And when my father got me the interview there, the Star was also known as the town's conservative paper because of its editorial policies. Right. And the Washington Post was known as the liberal paper because of its editorial policies. But the Washington Post in those days allowed its news coverage to bleed into the editorial positions of the newspaper. There was not that rigid separation of church and state that we had at the Star. And it was a matter we took great pride in, that we played everything straight, the best obtainable version of the truth. Didn't mean neutrality, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But it meant this whole concept. I've never known a story that turned out like my preconceived notion of what it would be. In Watergate, first couple of days, I thought the story was going to go to the CIA. After a couple of days, it became somewhat evident it was heading toward the Nixon White House. Reporters who go out on the street and do that kind of reporting, like the Star did, they know that their predisposition about the story is not going to be what the story is really about. So it was also a better paper. It was an afternoon paper with not just a kind of excitement that comes from 5 editions a day, the rumble of the press underneath your feet, copy, people yelling copy all over the place, teletype machines clacking. There's a kind of excitement about it because of the way news was happening in the daytime. Dictationists with headsets on were taking, and I became a dictationist after a year there because I could type 90 words a minute. And that was kind of a bridge to becoming a reporter. And I'd taken typing with the girls in high school, so I managed to have that skill. But the physicality of that newsroom, the sheer energy, people saying, hey, Broder, take dictations, give your dictation to Bernstein over there. You're there with the president. You got 5 minutes to do this story, dictate it to him, and I take it down, screaming, shouting, smoke all over the place. When I went to the Washington Post, I thought I'd gone to work in an insurance company. It was so quiet and hushed. There was also none of the kind of esprit at the Post in those days as there was in the Star.
That's really interesting. I was wondering, we talked about this earlier, but I was wondering if you wanted to tell us a little bit about how you got hired at this first job at such a young age.
Well, this goes back to the idea of it being a conservative newspaper, and yet its coverage was straighter. My father was a union organizer for the Government Workers Union, the United Public Workers and Federal Workers of America, represented mostly people who worked like at the Bureau of Engraving and printing the money of the country, cafeteria workers in the government cafeterias. And the union had a strike in the early 50s. And to try and get government workers' pay raised to $1 an hour or so, the Post had a columnist, the government columnist, and this is the McCarthy era, who really red-baited the union and the strike in what he wrote about it. The Washington Star, the conservative paper, had a government columnist. His name was Joe Young, and he's responsible for me getting an interview with the management of the paper that got me hired. He covered this strike with great fairness. And so my father became a source for this government columnist. And my father could see I was probably not going to make it through high school. And so he called this guy, got me an interview with the nephew of the publisher of the paper, who was called the production manager. And the production manager of the paper took a look at me and said, boy, I thought that Joe Young said that you were going to graduate high school. And this is because I was 5'3" and freckled. And I was there in my new suit, cream-colored suit from No Label Louis downtown. And he said, why don't you come back here when you graduate? Well, that's not what I wanted to hear. I sort of thought, well, maybe this interview is going to change my life. And then, after being turned down, he took me through a door and into the newsroom. And I saw this amazing scene that I've described. The most purposeful errands in the nation seemed to be going on all around me. And he led me down the center aisle of the newsroom toward the city desk, national desk. And I was like a puppy on a leash, just straining so I could take it all in, not to go too fast. And a copy boy came up with a dolly full of newspapers. And this guy handed me one. It was still warm from the presses. And I could feel the rumble of the presses underneath me. And there was no question in that moment. I knew that I wanted to be a newspaper man, but I wasn't hired. So I called this production editor the next day and said, I got a autobiography that I wrote for my journalism class I'd like to bring down to you. And he said, okay, bring it down. And I gave it to him. Nothing happened. And I kept calling him, and I take the streetcar downtown, and I finally sat outside his office. And he said, can you type? And I said, yeah, I can type. He said, well, go downstairs and take a typing test. Go see the company nurse. If you can believe the paternalism of the place was such that there was a company nurse in a newspaper. And I took this typing test, and I got a call from him on Monday. And he said, boy, you didn't tell me you could type like that. And I got hired at $29 a week as a copy boy.
It's so funny because when you're talking, my grandfather, Howard Fast, was also of your parents' vintage. And he also dropped out of high school and went into working at a very young age. I mean, it wasn't so unusual to be that young and work.
By that time, I was the youngest copy boy by 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And when I became a reporter in the summer at age 19, I was the youngest reporter by probably 6 years.
Yeah.
And also by that time, one of the significant things that was happening in journalism was that only college graduates were really being hired to be reporters. The last reporter when I went to the Star who had not graduated college had been made a reporter maybe 4 or 5 years earlier. And that figures in the story in this book because this kid, me, they make me a reporter when I'm 19, but they say you got to finish school if you're going to stay on as a reporter. And there was no way I was going to continue to be a student at the university. I've been thrown out already. I flunked out. I was there largely as a haven for the draft because it was the beginning of the Vietnam War. And that figures in this story all along. I'm thinking, what am I going to do if I can't graduate from college? And these people sort of say, you're probably not going to be able to be a reporter if you don't graduate.
One of the questions in the comments, and I'm curious I think it's a good question, is if you loved the Star so much, which you clearly did, why did you go to the Washington Post?
Well, what happened was that I was made a reporter in summer when I was 19. And I managed to not only hold my own, but I really was able to do the kinds of stories that all the local reporters were doing. And on top of which, there was a feature that was inaugurated that summer on the local page, the front page of the local page. It was decided instead of the local hard news coverage, they would do a feature about people with interesting jobs, about things that were happening in the city, about neighborhoods. And I started writing these features. And by the end of the summer and the fall, Sid Epstein, my mentor, this great city editor, thought that indeed I should stay on the staff, as a reporter, as did all of the other editors. But the managing editor of the paper, and I would say in this book, the only figure that's not treated, I think, in many ways with respect and affection is the managing editor of the paper. And he refused to let me stay on the staff as a reporter after that summer. And Sid Epstein said to him, hey, look, we're hiring new people. Bernstein has done all this work. Look what he's put in the paper. Why can't we just make him the hire? And the managing editor said no. And Sid Epstein told me this, and I said, I want to see the managing editor. I'd never been in his office in the whole time I had been there. And I said, why can't I stay on? And he said to me these words that became kind of famous in the newsroom. Carl, you really put your shoulder to the wheel, but experience is no substitute for the training program. And the training program was this really amazing tutorial that they had for new reporters, for dictationists who were becoming reporters, newly hired reporters who were young. You would go to all the beats on the city side, welfare, police beat, all the government bureaus. But I'd covered all that already. And he's telling me experience is no substitute for this training program. And that's when I said in that line in the book, I loved the Star, but it really didn't love me. It was really about this managing editor. But I knew at that point I was going to have to leave the paper. And a favored assistant city editor had been named the editor of the Elizabeth, New Jersey Daily Journal. Town, Elizabeth, New Jersey, working class town, exit 13 on the turnpike by the Bayway refinery, spilling its noxious fumes across the turnpike. And he asked me would I come up there with him. Would I like to do that? I could do anything I want. I could write a column. I could go on the desk. He'd give me 8 years seniority, like a journeyman reporter, full pay. And I could do anything. And I said, yeah, I'll come up. So I went to Elizabeth, sight unseen. It was an awful place. But it was also, I learned to cover different kinds of people and different stories in Elizabeth. For instance, I'd been there like 2 weeks, and the mayor of the town had a luncheon once a week with the owner of the town bowling alley, the police chief, the foreman of the Singer sewing machine plant, which had 10,000 employees there, a guy from the Teamsters Union named Tony Provenzano, who I ended up spending a good deal of time with, learning about the docks in Elizabeth and Port Newark. And of course, Provenzano is the guy who ended up in jail and probably, for the rest of his life, and probably is responsible for the death of Jimmy Hoffa. But all these amazing characters. And in the year that I wanted to get out of Elizabeth after I'd been there a year, but in that year, I managed somehow to win a bunch of prizes. There was a state newspaper association, and I won prizes for news on deadline, feature writing, and investigative reporting. And I decided I got to get out of here. And I applied for jobs at the New York Herald Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, Chicago Sun-Times, the Washington Daily News, the Scripps Howard paper in Washington, and the Washington Post. I got turned down at all of them, except because I didn't have a college degree, except the Washington Daily News, which said they knew my work. They said, come right away. But I also got an interview at the Washington Post. And the city editor, and I really wanted to work at the Post because by then Ben Bradley had come into the paper. He was the managing editor. He was going to be the editor, everyone knew. He was doing incredible things to the newspaper. I knew I wanted to go to work there. And I got an interview with the city editor. And he said, well, you don't have a college degree. Why do you think you can be a reporter here? And I said, I had the best education you could ever have. I got educated at the Washington Star under Sid Epstein. And this city editor said, I looked at your clips. It probably is the best education you could have had. And he hired me.
This segues into another actual question that the listeners wrote in the chat, which I am also curious about, which is, how do you think that the Washington Post became a better paper than the Washington Star?
First of all, the great mistake that the Star ownership made was in 1954. There was another paper in the city called the Times Herald that published 10 editions a day, especially morning editions. And it was up for sale. And Eugene Meyer, the publisher of the Washington Post, bought it for a song. And the Star, in its arrogance, it was the dominant paper for 100 years, going back to Lincoln, didn't bid on it. And it was an afternoon paper, and the suburbs were too hard to get the paper out there. Television news was beginning, and the Post, once it bought the Times Herald and got its features, it became an economic powerhouse that it had never been. So the Star and its circulation doubled just like that. And so the Star had a bigger circulation. So already the Star was in trouble in those regards, even though it was a better paper when I went to work there. And what happened at the Washington Post was Ben Bradley and Katharine Graham. Katharine Graham, who had some experience as a newspaper reporter, which actually was a highlight of her young life, and she writes about it magnificently. She worked in San Francisco as a reporter. And so she knew the business. It's a myth that she didn't know newspapers. She really did. And we all know her story at this point. She did this miraculous thing, including hiring Ben Bradley. And I could see what was happening. Bradley had a kind of an imagination and a kind of drive and a kind of notion of reporting and of what a newspaper could do. He created the style section of the Washington Post. The hell with the women's pages, he said. The hell with these old traditions. Let's write about, yes, society, upper crust, music, arts, but let's create a new kind of section for it. He hired amazing writers, just amazing writers. The Star had great writers too, and I'd studied them. They'd never be as good as most of them, but you think about Mary McGrory, who eventually came to the Washington Post. We had a guy at the Star, owned a sloop. He would go to Chesapeake Bay and write these prose poems about baymen who lived in these little towns on little islands in the Chesapeake Bay and still spoke Elizabethan English. Incredible writers at the Star, but Bradley then started hiring the best reporters in the country for both the national desk and the city editor he had put in, started hiring some amazing people for local coverage. And it just took off, and then came the Pentagon Papers a year before Watergate. The Times had really broken the story of the Watergate Papers, but then when it was, it looked like there might be a prior restraint, and the case went to the Supreme Court. They did not publish exclusively, and the Washington Post then became the second paper that had the Pentagon Papers. And it was a courageous decision, obviously, as was at the Times, to publish the Pentagon Papers. And it was a huge moment in the history of the Washington Post. And it gave the paper a kind of identity and a kind of attitude about being courageous, that it made Watergate much easier in some ways, because by then you had the precedent of Katharine Graham and Ben Bradley saying, we publish the truth. And that's what our decision is.
So let's go to this question from Arlene. What do you think Ben Bradley and Kay Graham would think of the quote unquote pundit class that are more concerned with appearing clever than in reporting news?
I think they would turn up their nose and turn their head the other way and say, this is not who we are. That they, in many ways, picked up the same traditions that had been at the Star and made them their own. That this idea of the best obtainable version of the truth, that really was what Ben Bradley and Katharine Graham's newspaper was about. And it's what enabled them to back us up in Watergate. I mean, you think about this. I mean, I was 16 when I went to work at the Star, but Woodward and I were 28 and 29 50 years ago when the Watergate break-in occurred. It'll be 50 years on June the 17th. And when you think about it, we were local reporters. We did not have the experience of covering the President of the United States. I've seen some presidents, but I never really covered them on a daily basis. Yeah, I covered the assassination of Kennedy and inauguration, things like that. But no, and here were these two kids out on a limb with the future of the paper actually hanging from that limb. If we made, people ask a lot of times, were you afraid for your lives in Watergate? There are a couple moments where maybe we had been warned that people's lives might be in danger, possibly including our own, but we didn't take that too seriously. A couple of times maybe we did. But what were we really afraid of? Making a mistake. That was the danger. If we made a mistake, a whole ship could go down, including the Washington Post, because the stakes were so high. And here we had this editor and publisher that put their trust in us. Then tell a little story about Katharine Graham. There came a point in Watergate, Nixon tried to make our conduct in Watergate the issue, the conduct of Woodward, myself, Ben Bradley, the Washington Post, rather than that of the president and his men. And it worked. It worked for a good, and this too has some relevance to today. it worked for a long time. Our colleagues in the press didn't believe our stories for a couple months. I'd say, well, who are these young people writing these stories? What about, they'd been taken in by the myth of the new Nixon with his smooth, well-oiled White House machinery. And there came a time when Nixon's re-election committee filed a suit aimed at getting at our sources. And I got a call in the newsroom from the guard downstairs, and he said, there's a subpoena server here. And he's got a subpoena for you and your notes. I said, well, just keep them down here. Don't let them up on the elevator. And I called Ben Bradley, and I guess Bob Woodward wasn't there that day. And I called Bradley, and I said, I just got a call. It's subpoena servers here. He said, don't do anything. I'm going to call Catherine Graham upstairs. He called me back a few minutes later, and he said, all right, I've talked to Catherine. She says those notes are not. I still get emotional about this a little bit. Catherine says those notes aren't yours. They're hers. And if anybody's going to go to jail, she's going to go to jail. And then Bradley said to me, can you imagine what would happen if our gal walks into the courthouse and they put her in the slam? And he said, it'd be amazing. But think of what she did there.
Yeah.
And to me, it was emblematic of what she and Ben Bradley did during those 2 years that we were covering Watergate.
Susan H. asks, how does Carl define journalism in today's world? Is it still a profession?
Yes, when it's done right. And I talked before about we have all of these tools today. We have the internet. We have Google. We have all of these things. But you can't do good reporting just by going to Google. You got to get out of the office. And so if you were to ask me, well, what's the worst aspect of our journalism today? Laziness. Mm-hmm. Too many reporters stay in the newsroom and don't go out of it. And it's not just anecdotal. I think all people who work in newsrooms today are aware of this fact. And then the management becomes accustomed to it. And they often save money by doing this, using fewer reporters, because it's pretty easy to just go to Google, just look it up. And I think this whole notion of the complexity of the truth, context as an element of the truth, a bunch of disparate facts are not necessarily the truth. Facts can, in fact, that's a good sentence. Facts can illuminate actually lies and perpetuate lies if you don't have the context, if you don't go to all those other sources and get contrary facts, perhaps. So to me, this is the biggest problem that we have in journalism. But let me also talk about, this is an era of great reporting too. I think we need to look at what happened in the Trump White House. That really it's the greatest White House reporting by the largest number of news organizations in the Trump years that I've ever seen in my lifetime. 8, 9, 10, 11 news organizations and great reporters. And books too. Bob's books, other people's books on the Trump presidency. What do we know about the Trump presidency and how do we know it? We know it because of these reporters. We don't know it from any other way in significance. So it's been an amazing thing. How do we, we're now building a record of the first seditious president of the United States. We haven't imagined that. A seditious president encouraging, courting insurrection, which is really what sedition is. And we've been reporting on this. And one other thing, there's a line in the book that says that, and I'm learning this at the Star covering civil rights. And it says, I'm learning that the truth is not neutral. And at the time, I was covering Rita Schwerner, who was the wife of Mickey Schwerner, who was one of the civil rights workers. Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman. And I was sent to cover her arrival at National Airport because she was going to visit Lyndon Johnson to say, hey, please, let's have a better search for my husband and the two other civil rights workers who at that time were missing, when in fact they were under the levee, buried under the levee after being shot to death because they had tried to register Black voters in Mississippi. And their bodies were found a few days after I'd spent this day with Rita Schwerner when she went to go to see President Johnson. That's not neutral. There's no neutrality about a lynching. There's no neutrality about killing 3 people and burying them under a levee, and the local sheriffs are saying, oh no, we didn't have anything to do with it. That's not. So yes, our responsibility is fairness, but it's not about neutrality. And the example I give of this, let's say you've got a bank robbery, and the guy goes in with a gun, sticks it in the face of the teller and says, give me all the money you got, put it in the bag. There's a video camera taking it all down. He runs out of the place, goes up to 100 miles away, the far reaches of Connecticut, and stays there until he's arrested. And he says, no, I've been here for the last 3 weeks. I've been here, in fact, for a month and a half. I was nowhere near the city in that alibi, and talked to my sister with whom I'm staying here, and talked to my nieces and nephews. He goes on and got a lawyer, says, we got an alibi that he didn't rob that bank, but I've got the videotape. And it shows him, and you hear his words saying, give me your money. Am I supposed to write a 50-50 story about that? Or am I going to write 90% of the story about the videotape and 10% about the alibi? And it's an extreme example, but really it gets to the heart. We've been saddled with this myth of objectivity and 50%ism. It's not what we do. It's not neutral what we do. What the reporting about the Trump presidency was, no, it was not neutral. It showed us the truth. And yes, it was fair. I remember the first time I went to CNN, very early in the Trump presidency, I said, the President of the United States is a serial liar. And I said, it takes my breath away to say this on national television. It sounds pejorative. It's not pejorative. I'm saying it because I've talked to 15 members, Republicans in the Senate and the House, who tell me about his serial lies and how it bothers them. Of course, now we see it doesn't bother them. They've now embraced these serial lies. But whatever the case, it was based on reporting. It sounds pejorative, but it's not.
So I feel like we have to talk about anti-Semitism for 2 seconds. And one of the questions here is from Bruce, who asks, can you discuss some of and you must have been subjected to some anti-Semitism in the South. So he was wondering if you could talk about an early encounter with anti-Semitism if you had it.
Well, let's go to today. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but I know very often when I'm on the air and if I want to flagellate myself, I'll look at Twitter sometimes, and the number of anti-Semitic comments about me, I'm astonished. I can't believe it. It's one of the reasons that I know how deep anti-Semitism goes in this culture. And in fact, we all know that there has been an awful, it's not just anecdotal, it's in the numbers of events and incidents and people killed. We haven't had anything in this country like this. Certainly, you have to go way, way back. And it's more than a scourge because it's cultural. There are aspects of the culture that we now have in the country. I'm hardly about to say that it's run rampant. It's not anything like a majority of the people or anything like that who are but it's dangerous. It's dangerous not only to Jews, it's dangerous to who we are as a people and a country. And also, not just anti-Semitism in this country, but in Europe, all over the world, we're seeing. And look at Hungary, look at Poland, look at anti-Semitism that's kind of sweeping through Europe in a way that has not for an awful long time. So I think it's something we need to be both aware of, and it's got to be part of our coverage. And let me say one more thing about it, and that is that I think we've made a mistake in some of our coverage to look at Israel as the Likud party in our coverage without making the distinction about Israel being a divided country. And I think we need to do more reporting on Israel and the complexity of Israel, the best obtainable version of truth. It's a related subject, but the idea that the Likud and the views of the Likud are representative of all of Israel, it's a myth, but yet so much of our coverage has been consistent with that myth.
I'm curious, and this is a question in the chat too. What papers do you read?
I read the New York Times. I read the Washington Post. I go to Drudge online because it takes me to other views and other papers and other news institutions, as well as the mainstream papers and news organizations. I read the Atlantic. I read a New Yorker. I read some books. I'm a slow reader. I watch the news, not religiously, but I'm on CNN. I watch a good deal of CNN. I take a look at Fox every once in a while to see what they're doing over there. Watch some on MSNBC. But basically, I think that's the way I go about it. And one thing, and this is a bad thing, let me say that one of the terrors of the internet, look, the internet is a liberating force in all kinds of things, but it also has terrible downsides. But in terms of the news, I find myself looking at the same story being updated 6 times a day. And if I'm reading the New York Times or the Washington Post online, as opposed to the paper itself, I don't get to the rest of the paper because I keep reading over and over the big stories and how they're advancing slowly. That's just my own weakness. But the result is it's not as satisfactory. You know, a newspaper or a great news report, it's not just the over serious. It's got features. It's got all kinds of wonderful things in it. It's got style. It's got fashion. It runs the gamut. You read it. I read it just online. I deny myself too often those pleasures, even though the front page of the Times site or Post site will often have reference to those stories, including some wonderful stories by my son Jacob, who's a New York Times. You know Jacob, who's a New York Times reporter and great reporter and writer. I don't go through the paper closely enough.
And Jacob just did a really, really humongous and brilliant story in the paper last week.
He did,
right.
About Ron Perlman. And he also was another reporter, actually wrote the obit of one, wonderful account of the life of Andre Leon Talley. It was
Yes, let's hear about Max.
Let's hear about Max. Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk about family. Max, who when he was 2 years old, I could tell how musical he was, and just because he banged in tune with some guitar playing I was doing. I got him a guitar when he was 3, and it's all he ever wanted to do was music. And he's now the guitar player, one of the guitar players for Taylor Swift and Miley Cyrus.
Wow.
And so he's a star wearing spandex in stadiums.
There's a question from the audience.
I should add here that one of the joys of working at the Washington Post was that I was a rock critic at the Washington Post. That gig ended the day of the Watergate break-in.
One of the questions here is, where did your Southern accent come from?
It probably is a product of two things. Washington was a Southern town when I grew up there. And I probably have a desire to hold on to it. That might be it's not an affectation. It's just something that I've kept. And sometimes it comes out more than others. But it's not really a deep Southern accent. It's not really Virginia. It has much more to do with Washington when it was a Southern town. It has there's a Baltimore accent, which I can tell like that. There's a Philadelphia accent. But as you go farther south, and by the time you get to Washington, my mother, she didn't talk quite like I did. But she too had something of this local accent. But I'll try to talk straighter.
I think it's good. Do you want to talk to us? There are a lot of questions about journalism, and there are a lot of questions about local news. Tell me what direction you want to go in. Journalism,
the two come together. They're the same.
Yes.
Local news is an aspect of journalism. But shoot, go ahead.
Okay, so lot of local newspaper. Lois asks, local news is going out of business. Is there a real problem? And if so, what can be done about it? And Beth, this is sort of the same, also asks, can you please comment on how this disappearance of local news impacts on journalism on the street as life unfolds in real time?
Well, it's been a terrible loss because, and if you look at the larger culture of the country, including politically, our social fabric has been torn. Our civic compact has just been buried in many regards. And the death of local news, of great local newspapers, even good local newspapers with good coverage. What did these newspapers do? They held together the fabric of civic life all over America, and also not just small newspapers. Take the Los Angeles Times, still exists, but a shadow of itself. When the Chandler family owned it, the LA Times was a cohesive force for all of Southern California. That cohesion started, I think, to disintegrate in large measure because of what happened to the Los Angeles Times as it lost its position and importance and the quality of its coverage. I think that has happened in towns and cities all over America. We attribute a lot of it to the internet, which process was already underway in the 80s and the 90s when big chains like Gannett, Knight Ridder, others came into towns and cities, bought a newspaper, often in a 2-newspaper town, stripped it, absolutely stripped it of 3/4, half of the reporters in the newsroom, became an advertising vehicle without this great local coverage, without covering all the civic enterprises, without covering local business, just shells of them former selves. Then these outfits like Gannett, especially, maybe the most rapacious of all in this regard, did it all over America, came into towns and cities, then had a joint operating agreement with the second paper in town, eventually bought that one, closed it down, and you ended up, and eventually what you had was no news. And then through the 80s and 90s, the newspaper business in this country was operating at 18 or 19% profit. How? Because these outfits stripped the papers of everything meaningful, by and large, and they became just advertising vehicles until finally the internet came along, and then they were really finished to a large degree. So what do we miss? We miss the coverage of who we are in towns and cities all over this country. And part of that loss is it has to do with larger forces in the country, because I think you can start to see again this cohesion around certain ideas, principles, people living together. We've lost a lot of that with the loss of local news. And one last thing is television local news. It's awful. It's terrible in this country. It's been that way for 50 years. I would ask the people who are with us tonight, does anyone think that wherever they live, that what they see on their local television news at 11 o'clock at night or 10 in the morning is really a reflection of the city, town, community they live in? I mean, even 50 years ago, we called it lead and bleed because of the sensationalist notion of so much of it. There are exceptions, but most markets around the country, local news is a horror. So we now have lost part of the accounting of the civic compact that we've had in this country.
I've got a lot of questions here about
I'll try to answer shorter, because I have been known to be loquacious, as people in my family often tell me, and friends.
Never say that.
Certainly
never ever say that. But I'm hearing there are a lot of questions here. It's not frequent that you hear the mainstream media is liberally biased. Do you think that the news is reported as not neutral, or do you think it's 50-50? And are people capable of being, I think I'm getting a lot of questions here that are about like, how do you sort of read the news? What sort of can you trust and what can you not trust? And have you seen, another question that I see in the doc is, do you feel that there was a decline in the sort of truthfulness after some of the changes in the legislation, in the way that news was sort of more, there was a fairness doctrine, there were certain things that made news more sort of equal timey? I'm curious, do you see a change in that?
I think we got to look at something else. And then I keep using the word culture, that we have a tendency, more than a tendency today, to look at news, media, and politics as separate entities from the larger culture. That all of the significant things, I think, that are going on in the country, in our politics and in our media, have to do with this larger culture and cultural questions about who we are as a people. Not just about Washington, it's about the people out there. Washington, to a large extent, is a reflection of this culture out there. The Trump half of this country following him, and the Republican Party, and we can talk about that in a minute, part of a larger cultural question. And the most significant thing about what you're asking, I think, is about the people themselves who are consumers of news and information. What are they looking for? Are they looking for the best obtainable version of the truth? At the time of Watergate, I would say yes, even though all the polls show us that most people believe Nixon rather than what they were reading in the papers up until the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, which is a good while through the coverage. Well, people today, and I think we know this more than anecdotally because there have been an awful lot of surveys by Knight and other organizations, the Pew Center does great polling. People are looking not for the best obtainable version of the truth. They're looking for information to reinforce what they already believe, to their political beliefs, their cultural beliefs, their religious beliefs, their ideologies. What is the success of Fox based on? That's what it's based on. It doesn't have anything to do with news. It has to do with people looking for more information to fuel what they already believe. So that's a very different culture than existed at the time of Watergate. At the time of Watergate, as the story went forward, there was more and more willingness. There was a consensus that built that Nixon had to go, especially after the tapes. And let's take a minute to look at Watergate aside from this question about news. What happened in Watergate? Donald Trump had been acquitted twice after being impeached. Richard Nixon, impeached once, left office. Well, how did that happen? The Republican Party. The difference is in the Republican Party. In Nixon's case, you had a unanimous vote of the Senate of the United States to create the Senate Watergate Committee. You couldn't have a unanimous vote of the Senate today on anything. And after that, you had the Senate Watergate investigation, a bipartisan investigation. And from that, articles of impeachment were drawn by the House Judiciary Committee with courageous votes, key votes for the articles of impeachment coming from Republicans, including from Virginia, southern states. And then it was a certainty that Nixon would be impeached. But the question was, would he be convicted by the Senate or acquitted like Donald Trump? And nobody knew. Nixon certainly thought that he would be acquitted in the Senate trial. And he was looking forward to a Senate trial on that acquittal. And yet, the leadership of the Republican Party, led by Barry Goldwater, the great conservative, 1964 nominee of his party, and leader of the House, the Republican leader of the House, Senator Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, and a couple of others, Goldwater took these leaders down to the White House to meet with Nixon. And Nixon looked at Goldwater across the table, fully expecting that Goldwater would tell him, "You're going to be acquitted, Mr. President." Nixon looked at him and said, "Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate? You're keeping track." Goldwater looked at Nixon, and Woodward and I interviewed Goldwater about this. He pulled out his diary and started to read from it about this meeting across the table. Nixon looked at Goldwater, and Goldwater looked back at him, and Goldwater said, "Mr. President, right now you might have 4 to 6 votes, but you're never going to have mine." And at that moment, Nixon knew he was going to have to resign. And he did resign. There was nothing about a coup. He left office. Look what we have today. We have another criminal president of the United States, but much worse in many regards. We have an authoritarian president who really is the first seditious president in our history. What is sedition? Enabling and calling for and encouraging insurrection. That's really the definition. A seditious president. In the Confederacy, yeah, we had sedition. We had it. Jefferson Davis was a member of Congress. He wasn't the president of the United States. Look where we are today with this president or ex-president of the United States. What's the real difference is the Republican Party, a party that has been held captive. I did a story on CNN about 3/4 of the way through Trump presidency. I've been told by so many aides to senators, Republican senators, how their bosses, the senators, despised and really held Trump in such disdain. And they did. And so finally, but they were craven. Senators never said it out loud. And today, we all know what this party has become. It's become the party of Trump and fear of Trump. But finally, I did a story that named 21 Republican members of the Senate who held Trump in disdain. Not a one of them denied it. And so the difference today is in the Republican Party to a large extent. This party is beholden to these authoritarian notions of Trump, beholden to this big lie, beholden to voter suppression. Let's go back to my book about the Washington Star. One of the things I got to cover, and there's a good deal of it in there, is passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It took away the poll tax. It made it possible, after all of these years of lynchings and being buried under the levee. What happened? There was a Civil Rights Act of 1964 with bipartisan support. Everett McKinley Dirksen, the Republican leader of the Senate, passed the Civil Rights Act because largely Kennedy had been very reluctant to introduce civil rights legislation, but he finally did. Lyndon Johnson continued it, and the great Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, but then the Voting Rights Act. What is the Republican Party committed to today? What was that vote yesterday or the day before yesterday? To strip the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It was supported by Republicans. So sense of history also helps. I'm old, relatively speaking. I'm 77 now. But you don't need to be old to know our history in this country. And that's another thing I think that's a real problem, the lack of knowledge of history in this country. And I don't think that that is applicable just to one segment of the political class.
We are out of time. So this was amazing. You are a brilliant genius. Thank you everyone for joining us and for the great questions. And, I'm sure I think our moderator is going to come back, but there are a lot of great programs that will continue on, I think, next week. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Molly. Thanks to those who are here with us.